Chapter 6 of On the Iron at Big Cloud by Frank L. Packard. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Chapter 6 The Builder. There are two sides to every story, which is a proverb so old that it is in the running with Father Time himself. It is repeated here because there must be some truth in it. Anything that can stand the wear and tear of the ages and the cynics and the wise old philosophical owls without getting any knockout dints punched in its vital spots must have some sort of merit fundamentally. What? Anyway, the company had their side and the men's version differed, of course. Maybe each in a way was more or less right and equally in a way more or less wrong. Maybe, too, both sides lost their tempers and got their crown sheets burned out before the arbitration powwow had a chance to get the line clear and give anybody rights, schedule or otherwise. However, be that as it may, whoever was right or whoever was wrong, one or the other, or both, it is the strike, not the ethics of it, that has to do with. But just a moment, we're overrunning our holding orders. From the time the last rail was spiked home and bridging the Rockies was a reality, not a dream, from then to the present day there isn't very much better a way of describing the Hill Division than to call it rough and ready. Coming down right to cases, the history of that piece of track, the history of the men who gave the last that was in them to make it, and the history of those who have operated it since, isn't far from being a pretty typical and comprehensive example of the pulsing, dominating, dogged, go-forward spirit of a continent whose strides and progress are the marvel of the world. And withal, it is an example so compact and concrete that through it one might see and view the larger picture in all its angles and in all its shades. Heroism and fame and death and failure, it has known them all, but ever and above all else it has known the indomitable patience, the indomitable perseverance, the indomitable determination against which no times, nor conditions, nor manners, nor customs, nor obstacles can stand. The spirit of the new race and the great new land, the essence and the germ of it. Building a road through the Rockies and tapping the Sierras to give zest to the finish wasn't an infant's performance, and operating it single track on crazy wild cuts and fills and tangents and curves and tunnels and trestles, with nature to battle and fight against, isn't any infant's performance either. The Hill Division was rough and ready. It always was, and it is now, just naturally so. And Big Cloud, the divisional point, snuggling amongst the buttes in the eastern foothills, is even more so. It boasts about every nationality classified in certain erudite editions of small books with big names, and to top that has an extra anomaly or two left over and up its sleeve for good measure. But mostly it is, or rather was, it has changed some with the years, composed of Indians, bad Americans, a scattering of Chinese, and an indescribable medley of humans from the four quarters of Europe the Cockney, the Polack, the Swede, the Russian, and the Italian, laborers on the construction gangs. Big Cloud was a little more than rough and ready. It wasn't exactly what you'd call a health resort for finicky nerves. So take it by and large, the Hill Division, from one end to the other, wasn't the quietest or most peaceful locality on the map even before the trouble came. After that, well, mention the big strike to any of the old timers and they'll talk fast enough and hard enough and say enough in a minute to set you wondering if the biographers hadn't got mixed on dates and if Dante hadn't got his material for that little hair stiffener of his no further away than the Rockies, and no longer back than a few years ago. But no matter. The story opens on the strike, not the ethics of it. There's some hard feeling yet, too much of it to take sides one way or the other. But then, apart from that, this is not the story of a strike. It is the story of men, a story that the boys tell at night in the darkened roundhouses in the shadow of the big 10-wheelers on the pits, while the steam purrs softly at the gauges and sometimes a pop valve lifts with a catchy sob. They tell it, too, across the tracks at headquarters, or on the road and in construction camps, but they tell it better, somehow, in the roundhouse, though it is not an engineer's tale. And Clarihue, the night turner, tells it best of all. Set forth as it is here, it takes no rank with him, but all are not so fortunate as to have listened while Clarihue talked. Just one word more to make sure that the red isn't against us anywhere, and we'll get to Keating and Spirlaw. Just a word to say that Carleton, Royal Carleton, was superintendent then, and Regan was master mechanic, Harvey was division engineer, Spence was chief dispatcher, and Riley was trainmaster. Pretty good men, that little group, pretty good railroaders. There have never been better. Some of them are bigger now in the world's eyes, heads of systems instead of departments, and some of them will never railroad any more. However, if you haven't forgotten Shanley, you will recall the Glacier Cañon, and most of all you will recall the Glacier River with its treacherous sandy bed that snuggled close to the right of way and forced the track hard against the rocky walls of the mountain's base. The havoc the Glacier played with the operating department on the night of Shanley's memorable heroism was not the first time it had misbehaved itself, nor was it the last. That was the trouble. It washed out the roadbed with such consistent persistency, on so little provocation, and did it so effectually as to stir at last to resentment even the torpid blood of the directors down East. So they voted the sum, though it hurt, and solaced themselves with the thought that after all it was economy, which was true. There was only one thing to do against that over hospitable and affectionate little stream, and that was to get away from it. But before proceeding to do so, in order to get elbow room to work so that the flyers and the fast mails and the traffic generally wouldn't be hung up every time a Pollock swung a pick, they pushed the track out over the chattering river on a long, temporary, hybrid trestle of wood and steel. That done, the rest was up to Spirlaw and Keating. The plans called for the shaving down of the mountainside, the barbering mostly to be done with dynamite, for the beard of the Rockies is not the down of a youth. So when the trestle was finished, Spirlaw, with a gang of some 30 Polacks, moved into construction camp, promptly tore up the old track, and set themselves to the task at hand. A little later, Keating joined them. Spirlaw was a road boss and the roughest of his kind. Physically, he was a giant, and which of the three was the hardest, his face, his fist, or his tongue, would afford the sporting element a most excellent opportunity to indulge in a little bookmaking with the odds about even all around. His hair was a coarse mop of tawny brown that straggled over his eyes, and his eyes were all black, every bit of them, there didn't seem to be any pupil at all, which gave them a glint that was harder than a cold chisel. Take him summed up, Spirlaw looked a pretty tough proposition, and in some ways, most ways perhaps, he was. He never denied it. "What the blue blazes do you think, huh?" he would remark, reaching into his hip pocket for his chewing, as he swept the other arm comprehensively over the particular crowd of sweating foreigners that happened to be under his particular jurisdiction at the time. "What do you think? You can't run cuts and fills with an outfit like this on soft soap and candy sticks, can you? Well then, huh?" That last "huh" was more or less conclusive. Very few cared to pursue the argument any further. At a safe distance, the big fellows on the division, as a salve to their consciences when humanitarian ideas were in the ascendancy, would bombard Spirlaw with telegrams which were forceful in tone and direful in threat, but that's all it ever amounted to. Spirlaw's work report for a day on anything from bridging a cañon to punching a hole in the bitter hard rock of the mountainside was a report that no one else on the division had ever approached, let alone duplicated. And figures count perhaps just a little bit more in the operating department of a railroad than they do anywhere else in the world. Spirlaw used the telegrams as spills to light a pipe as hard looking as himself, whose bowl was down at the heels on one side from much scraping, and on such occasions it was more than ordinarily unfortunate for the sour visaged Polack who should chance to arouse his ire. Some men possess the love of a fight, and their natures are tempestuous by virtue of their nationality, because some nationalities are addicted that way. This may have been the case with Spirlaw, or it may not. There's no saying, for Spirlaw's nationality was a question mark. He never delivered himself on the subject, and certainly there was no figuring out from the derivation of his name. That could have been most anything, and could have come from most anywhere. To say that opposites attract isn't any more original, any less gray bearded than the words at the head of these pages. Generally, that sort of thing is figured in the worn out, stale, familiarity breeds contempt realm of platitude, and at its unctuous repetition one comes to turn up his nose. But once in a while, life has a habit of getting in a kink or a twist that gives you a jolt and a different sidelight, and then somehow a thing like that rings as fresh and virile as though you had just heard it for the first time. As far as anyone ever knew, Keating was the only one that ever got inside of Spirlaw's shell, the only one that the road boss ever showed the slightest symptoms of caring a hang about, and yet on the surface between the two there was nothing in common. Where one was polished, the other was rough. Where one was weak, the other was strong. Keating was small, thin, pale-faced, and he had a cough that had sent him west in a hurry without waiting for the other year that would have given him his engineer's diploma from the college in the East. When the boy he wasn't much more than a boy dropped off at Big Cloud and Carleton read the letter he brought from one of the big Eastern operators, the super raised his eyebrows a little, looked him over, and sent him out to Spirlaw. Afterwards he spoke to Regan about him. " I didn't know what to do with him, Tommy, but I had to do something, what? Anyone with half an eye could tell that he had to be kept out of doors, though he might be able to help Spirlaw out a little as assistant, Guess he'll pick up the work quick enough. He don't look strong." " Mabbe it's just as well," grinned the master mechanic. " He won't be able to batter the gang any. One man doing that is enough when it's Spirlaw." Spirlaw heard about it before he saw Keating, and he swore fervently. " What the hell !" he growled. " Think I'm running a nursery or an outdoor sanatorium? I guess I've got enough to do without looking after sick kids. I guess I have. Fat lot of help he'll be. Help my eye. I don't need no help." But for all that, somehow, from the first minute when Keating got off the local freight that stopped for him at the camp and shoved out his hand to Spirlaw, it was different. After that, it was all Keating as far as the road boss was concerned. Queer the way things go. Keating looked about the last man on earth you would expect to find rubbing elbows with an iron-fisted foreman whose tongue was rougher than a barbed wire fence. The last man to hold his own with a slave-driven gang of ugly Polacks. He seemed too quiet, too shy, too utterly unfit, physically, for that sort of thing. The blood was all out of the boy, he got rid of it faster than he could make it. But his training stood him in good stead, and within his limitations he took hold like an old hand. That was what caught Spirlaw. He did what he was told, and he did what he could, did a little more than he could at times, which would lay him up for a bad 2 or 3 days of it. " Good man," Spirlaw scribbled across the bottom of a report one day, a day that was about equally divided between barking his knuckles on a Polac's head and feeding cracked ice to Keating in his bunk. Cracked ice? No, it wasn't on the regular camp bill of fare. But the company supplied it, for all that. Spirlaw, with supreme contempt for the dispatchers and their schedules and their train sheets, held up Number 12 and the porter of the Pullman for a goodly share of the commodity possessed by that colored gentleman. That's what Spirlaw thought of Keating. For the next few weeks after he struck the camp, Keating didn't have very much to say about himself, or anything else for that matter. But after he got a little nearer to Spirlaw and the mutual liking grew stronger, he began to open up at nights when he and the road boss sat outside the door of the construction shanty and watched the sun lose itself behind the mighty peaks, creep again with a wondrous golden tinted glow between a rift in the range, and finally sink with ensuing twilight out of sight. Keating could talk then. " Don't say what you ever took up engineering for," remarked Spirlaw one evening. " That's about the roughest kind of life I know. And you " I know," Keating smiled. " You think I'm not strong enough for it. Well, another year out here in the West and I'll be like a horse." " Sure you will," agreed Spirlaw hastily. " I didn't mean just that." Then he sucked his briar hard. Spirlaw wasn't much on therapeutics, he knew more about blasting rock, but down in his heart there wasn't much doubt about another year in the West for the boy, and another, all of them, only they would be over the Great Divide that one only crosses once when it is crossed forever. 6 months, 4, 3, just months, not years, was what he read in Keating's face. " What I mean," he amended, " was that you don't have to. From what you've said, I figured your folks back there would be willing to stake you in most any line you picked out, huh? "" No, I don't have to," Keating answered, and his face lighted up as he leaned over and touched the road boss on the sleeve. " But, Spirlaw, it's the greatest thing in the world, don't you see? A man does something, he builds. I'm going to be a builder of bridges and roads and things like that. I want to do something some day, something that will be worth while. That's why I'm going to be an engineer, because all over the world from the beginning the engineers have led the way, and they've left something behind them. I think that's the biggest thing that they can say of any man when he dies, that he was a builder, that he left something behind him. I'd like to have them say that about me. Well, after I put in another year out here, I'm a heap better even now than when I came. I'm going back to finish my course, and then well, you understand what I want to do, don't you? " There were lots of talks like that, evening after evening, and they all of them ended in the same way. Spirlaw would knock out his pipe against a stone or his boot heel, and figure he'd stroll up the camp a bit and make sure he was right for the night. A pretty hard man Spirlaw was, but under the rough and the brutal, the horny, thick shelled exterior was another self, a strange kind of self that he had never known until he had known Keating. It got into him pretty deep and pretty hard, the boy and his ambitions, and the irony of it, grim and bitter, deepened his pity and roused, too, a sense of fierce, hot resentment against the fate that mocked in its pitiless might so defenseless and puny a victim. To himself he came to call Keating the Builder, and one day when Harvey came down on an inspection trip he told the division engineer about it. That's how it got around. Carleton, when he heard it, didn't say anything, just crammed the dottle in his pipe down with his forefinger and stared out at the switches in the yards. They were used to seeing the surface of things plowed up and the corners turned back in the mountains. There weren't many days went by when something that slowed the raw didn't happen in one way or another, but it never brought callousness or indifference, only, perhaps, a truer sense of values. They had been blasting in the Canon for a matter of 2 months when the first signs of trouble began to show themselves. And the beginning was when the shop hands at Big Cloud went out, the boiler makers and the blacksmiths, the painters, the carpenters and the fitters. The construction camp, that is Spirlaw, didn't worry very much about this for the very simple reason that there didn't appear to be any reason why it or he should. That was Regan's hunt. But when the train crews followed suit and stray rumors of a fight or two at Big Cloud began to come in, with the likelihood of more hard on the heels of the first, it put a different complexion on things, for the rioting, what there had been of it, lay not at the door of the railroad boys, but with the town's loafers and hangers on, these and the foreign element, particularly the foreign element, the brothers and the cousins of the Polacks who were swinging the picks and the shovels under the iron hand of Spirlaw, their temporary lord and master, the Polacks, as pungently ungentle when amuck as starved pumas. Then the Brotherhood said quit, and the engine crews followed the trainmen. Things began to look black, and the headquarters began to find it pretty hard to move anything. The train schedule past the Canon was cut better than in half, and the faces of the men in the cabs and the cabooses were new faces to those in camp, the faces of the men the company were bringing in on hurry calls from wherever they could get them, from the plains east or the coast west. Every day brought reports of trouble from one end of the line to the other, more rioting, more disorder at Big Cloud, and in an effort to nip as much of it in the bud as possible, Carleton issued orders to stop all construction work, all except the work at Glacier Canon, for there the temporary trestle lay uneasy on his mind. The day after the stop orders went out elsewhere, a letter went out to Spirlaw. Spirlaw read it, and his face set like a thundercloud. He handed it to Keating. Keating read it and looked serious. " I guess things aren't any too rosy down there," he commented. Then slowly: " I've noticed our men seem a bit sullen lately. They don't care anything much about the strike. It must be a sort of sympathetic movement with the rest of their crowd that's running wild at Big Cloud. Only I don't just figure how they can know very much about what's going on. We don't ourselves, for that matter." Spirlaw smiled grimly. " I'll tell you how," he said. " I caught a Polak in the camp last night that didn't belong here, and I broke his head for the second time, see? He used to work for me about a year ago. That's when I broke it the first time. He's one of their influential citizens. Name's Coelho. Sneaked in here to stir up trouble. Guess he's sorry for it, I guess he is." " That's the first I've heard of it," said Keating, his eyes opening a little wider in surprise. " You was asleep," explained Spirlaw tersely. Keating stared curiously at the road boss for a minute, then he glanced again at the super's letter, which he still held in his hand. " Carleton says he is depending on you to put this work through if it's a possible thing. You don't really think we'll have any serious trouble here, though, do you? " Spirlaw bit deeply into his plug before he answered. " Yes, son, I do," he said at last. " And there's a good many reasons why we will, too. Once start 'em going, there's no worse hellions on earth than the breed we're living next door to. Furthermore, they don't love me. They're just afraid of me, as by holy razoo I mean 'em to be. Let 'em once get a smell of the upper hand and it'd be all day and good bye. Let 'em get going good at Big Cloud and they'll get going good here. They'll kind of figure then that there ain't any law to bother 'em, and unless I miss my guess, Big Cloud's in for the hottest celebration in its history, which'll be going some, for it's had a few before that weren't tamed by a damn sight." " Well," inquired Keating, " what do you intend to do? " Drawled Spirlaw reflectively, and there was a speculative look in his eyes as they roved over his assistant. " That's what I've been chewing over since I caught that skunk Coelho last night. As far as I can figure it, the chance of trouble here depends on how far those cusses go at Big Cloud. If I knew that, I'd know what to expect, huh? I thought I'd send you up to headquarters for a day. You could have a talk with the super, tell him just where we stand here, and size things up there generally. What do you say? "" Why, of course, all right, if you want me to," agreed Keating readily. " That's the boy," said Spirlaw heartily. " Number 12 will be along in half an hour. I'll flag her, and you can go and get ready now. I'll give you a letter to take along to Carleton." As Keating, with a nod of assent, turned briskly away, Spirlaw watched him out of sight, and the hint of a smile played over the lips of the road boss. He pulled a report sheet from his pocket, and on the back of it scrawled laboriously a letter to the superintendent of the Hill Division. It wasn't a very long letter, even with the P.S. included. His smile hardened as he read it over. " Super, Big Cloud," it read. " Dear Sir, replying to yours 8th inst., please send a couple of good 45s and plenty of stuffing." Plenty of stuffing was heavily underlined. " Yours respec, H. Spirlaw. P.S. Keep the boy up there out of this." The P.S. was even more heavily underscored than the other. Wise and learned in the ways of men and Polacks was Spirlaw. Spirlaw was not dealing with the possibility of trouble. It was simply a question of how long it would be before it started. He folded the letter, sealed it in one of the company's manilas, And as he watched Number 12 disappear around the bend, steaming east for Big Cloud with Keating aboard her and the epistle reposing in Keating's pocket, he stretched out his arms that were big as derrick booms and drew in a long breath like a man from whose shoulders had dropped a heavy load. That day Spirlaw talked from his heart to the men, and they listened in sullen, stupid silence, leaning on their picks and shovels. " You know me," he snapped, and his eyes, starting at the right of the gang, rested for a bare second on each individual face as they swept down the line. " You know me. You've been acting like sulky dogs lately. Don't think I haven't spotted it. You saw what happened to that coyote friend of yours that sneaked in here last night. I meant it as a lesson for the bunch of you as well as him. The yarns he was filling you full of are mostly lies, and if they ain't, it's none of your business anyhow. It won't pay you to look for trouble, I promise you that. You can take it from me that I'll bash the first man to powder that tries it. Get that? Well, then wiggle them picks a bit and get busy." " The man that hits first," said Spirlaw to himself as he walked away, " is the man that usually comes out on top. I guess them there few kind words of mine'll give 'em a little something to chew on till Carleton sends that hardware down. I guess they will, huh? " The camp was pretty quiet that night, quieter than usual. The cookhouse and the three bunkhouses that lay a few hundred yards east of the trestle might have been occupied by dead men for all the sounds that came from them. Occasionally Spirlaw, sitting out as usual in front of his own shanty that was between the trestle and the gang's quarters, saw a Polack or two skulk from one of the bunkhouses to the other, and he scowled savagely as he divided his glances between them and the sky. It looked like a storm in the mountains, and a storm in the mountains is never by any possibility to be desired, least of all was it to be desired just then. The men at work was one thing, the men cooped up for a day or 2 days of enforced idleness with the temper they were in was another. Spirlaw turned in that night with the low, ominous roll of distant thunder for a lullaby. Once in the night he woke suddenly at the sound of a splitting crash, and once, twice, and again, like a fierce, winkling stream of flame, the lightning filled the shack bright as day, while on the roof the rain beat steadily like the tattoo of a corps of snare drums. Spirlaw smiled grimly as the darkness shut down on him again. " Got the little builder out just about the right time, huh? " he remarked to himself, and turning over in his bunk went to sleep again, but even in his sleep the grim smile lingered on his lips. The morning broke with the steady downpour unabated. Everything ran water, and the rock cut was filled with it. Work was out of the question. Spirlaw ate his breakfast that the dripping camp cook brought him, and then, putting on his rubber boots and coat, started over for the track. Number 11 was due at the Canon at 7:30, and she would have the package of hardware he had asked Carleton for. But though 7:30 came, Number 11 did not. Neither did any other train, east or west. The hours passed from a long morning to drag through a longer afternoon. Something was wrong somewhere, and badly wrong at that. Spirlaw's face was blacker than the storm. Twice, once in the morning and once in the afternoon, he started down the track in the direction of Keefer's Siding, which was just what its name proclaimed it to be, a siding, no more, no less, only there was an operator there. Each time, however, he changed his mind after getting no further than a few yards. The Polacks could be no less alive to the fact than himself that something out of the ordinary was in the air, and second considerations swung strongly to the advisability of sticking close to the camp, so that his presence might have the effect of dampening the ardor of any mischief that might be brewing. It was not until well on toward 8 o'clock in the evening and the last of the twilight that the hoarse screech of a whistle sounded down the canon grade, a long blast and 3 short ones. It was belated Number 11 whistling for the camp. She wouldn't stop, just slow down to transact her business. Spirlaw, who was in his shanty at the time, snatched up his hat, dashed out of the door, and headed for the bend of the track. As he did so, out of the tail of his eye, he caught sight of the Polacks clustered with outpoked heads from the open doors of the bunkhouses. As he reached the line, Number 11 came around the curve, and the door of the express car swung back. The messenger dropped a package into his hand that the road boss received with a grim smile, and a word into his ear that caused Spirlaw's jaw to drop. Nor was that all that dropped, for from the rear end, as the train rolled by, dropped Keating. White faced and shaky the boy looked, more so than usual. Spirlaw stared as though he had seen an apparition, stared for a minute in silence before he could lay tongue to words, then they came like the outspout of a volcano. " What the hell's the meaning of this? " he roared. " Who in the double blank blazes let you out of Big Cloud, huh? I'll have some " Let's get in out of the wet," broke in Keating, smiling through a spell of coughing that racked him at that moment. " You can growl your head off then, if you like." And he started on a run for the shack. Once inside, Spirlaw rounded on the boy again, and he stopped only when he was out of breath. " Didn't Carleton tell you you was to stay where you was? " he finished bitterly. " Oh, yes," said Keating. " That's about the first thing he did say after he'd read your letter, when I gave it to him yesterday. Then I tumbled to why you had sent me out of camp. You're about as square as they make them, Spirlaw. You needn't blame Carleton. He had about all he could do without paying any attention to me or any one else. Had any wires or news here? " Spirlaw shook his head. " No, but I knew something was up because Number 11 is the first train in or out today. The express messenger just said that they'd cut loose in Big Cloud and wrecked about everything in sight, but I guess he was putting on a bit." " He didn't put on anything," said Keating slowly. " My God, Spirlaw, it was an awful night. The freight house and the shops and the roundhouse, what's left of them, are ashes. They cut all the wires, and then they cut loose themselves. The Polacks in that crowd, you know. Yes, they wrecked everything in sight. And there's a dozen lives gone out to pay for it." Keating stopped suddenly and again began to cough. Spirlaw looked at the boy uneasily and mechanically fumbled with the cords of the package he had laid upon the table. By the time he had removed the wrappers and disclosed two ugly, businesslike looking .45s and a half dozen boxes of cartridges, Keating's paroxysm had passed. " I guess it was exciting enough for me, anyhow." Keating tried hard to make his laugh ring true. " I'm a little weak from it yet." " If you weren't sick," Spirlaw burst out, " I'd make you sick for coming back here. You know well enough we'll get it next. You knew so well you came back to help." " I told Carleton he ought to send some help down here," Keating interrupted hastily. " And he just looked at me like a crazy man. He was half mad anyhow with the ruin of things. ' Help !' he flung out at me. ' Where's it coming from? Let Spirlaw yank up his stakes and pull out if things get looking bad." " Pull out !" shouted Spirlaw, in a sudden roar. " Pull out? Me? Not for all the cross-eyed, hamstrung Polacks on the system." " I think you'd better," said Keating quietly. " After what I saw last night, I think you'd better. There's no holding them. They were like savages, and the further they went the worse they got. They were backed up by whisky and the worst element in town. I was in the station with Carleton, Regan, Harvey, Riley and Spence and some of the other dispatchers. It was a regular pitched battle, and in spite of their revolvers the station would have gone with the rest if, along toward morning, the striking trainmen and the Brotherhood hadn't taken a hand and helped us out. I don't know that it's over yet, that it won't break out again to night, though I heard Carleton say there'd be a detachment of the police in town by 4 o'clock. I wish you would pull out, Spirlaw. You said yourself that all these fellows here needed to start them sticking their claws into you as a little encouragement from the other end. They've been afraid of you, but they hate you like poison. Once started, they'll be worse than the crowd at Big Cloud, for hate is a harder driver than whiskey. And then besides, I really think you'd be of more use in Big Cloud. You could do some good there, no matter what the end was, while here you're alone and you stand to lose everything and gain nothing. I wish you would pull out, Spirlaw, won't you? " Spirlaw reached out his hand and laid it on Keating's shoulder as he shook his head. " I've got a whole lot to lose," he answered, his hard face softening a little. " A whole lot. I can't say things the way you do, but I guess you'll understand. You got something that means a whole lot to you that you'd risk anything for. What you want to do and what you want to leave behind you when it comes along time to cash in. Well, I guess most of us have it in one way or another, though maybe I don't rank anywheres up to that. I reckon, too, a whole lot of us don't never think to put it in words. And a whole lot of us couldn't if we tried to. But it's there with any man that's any good. I'd rather go out for keeps than pull out. I'd rather they'd plant me. Do you think I'd want to live and have to cross the street because I couldn't look even a Polak in the eyes? A man'd be better dead. What? For a second Keating did not answer. He seemed to be weighing the possibility of still shaking the determination of the road boss before accepting it as irrevocable. Then, evidently coming to the conclusion that it was useless to argue further, he pointed to the revolvers. " Then the sooner you load those, the better," he jerked out. Spirlaw looked at him curiously, questioningly. " Because," went on Keating, answering the unspoken interrogation, " when I dropped off the train I saw that fellow Kuryla. He was pointed out to me in Big Cloud yesterday, and 3 or 4 more drop off on the other side. I didn't know they were on the train until then, of course, or I would have had them put off. There isn't much doubt about what they are here for, is there? "" So that's it !" Spirlaw ripped out with an oath. " No, there ain't much doubt." He snatched up a cartridge box, slit the paper band with his thumbnail, and, breaking the revolvers, began to cram the cartridges into the cylinders. His face was twitching and the red that flushed it shaded to a deep purple. Not another word came from him, just a deadly quiet. He thrust the weapons into his pockets, strode to the door, opened it, stepped over the threshold and stopped. An instant he hung there in indecision. Then he came back, shut the door behind him, sat down on the edge of his bunk, and looked at Keating grimly. " There's been one train along, there'll be another," he snapped. " And the first one that comes you'll get aboard of. I hate to keep these whining coyotes waiting, but " I'll take no train," Keating cut in coolly. " But I'll take a revolver." Spirlaw growled and shook his head. " Why didn't you tell me about Kuryla first? " he demanded abruptly. " You know why as well as I do," smiled Keating. " I wanted to get you away from here if I could. There wouldn't have been any use trying at all if I'd begun by telling you that. Wild horses wouldn't have budged you then. As for a train, what's the use of talking about it? There probably won't be another one along under an hour. In the meantime, give me one of the guns." " Not mu " Spirlaw's refusal died half uttered on his lips, as he sprang suddenly to his feet. Then he whipped out the revolvers and shoved one quickly into Keating's hand. Carried down with the sweep of the wind came the sound of many voices raised in shouts and discordant song. It grew louder, swelled, and broke into a high pitched, defiant yell. " Whisky," gritted Spirlaw between his teeth. " That devil Kuryla and the coyotes that came with him knew the best and quickest way to start the ball rolling. Well, son, I reckon we're in for it. The only thing I'm sorry about is that you're here, but that can't be helped now. You were white clean through to come. Holy Mother, listen to that! " Another yell broke louder, fiercer than before over the roar of the storm. Spirlaw stepped to the door and peered out. It was getting dark. The rain still poured in sheets, and the wind howled down the gorge in wild, furious, spasmodic gusts. Thin streaks of light strayed out from the doors of the bunkhouses, and around the doors were gathered shadowy groups. A moment more, and the shadowy groups welded into a single, dark mass. Came a mad, exultant yell from a single throat. It was caught up, flung back, echoed and re echoed by scores of voices, and the dark mass began to move. " Guess you'd better put out that light, son," said Spirlaw coolly. " There's no use making targets of our " Before he ended, before Keating had more than taken a step forward, a lump of rock shivered the little window and crashed into the lamp. It was out for keeps. A howl followed this exhibition of marksmanship, and following that a volley of stones smashed against the side of the shack thick and fast as hail. Then the onrush of feet. Spirlaw's revolver cut the black with a long, blinding flash, then another and another. Screams and shrieks answered him, but it did not halt the Polacks. In a mob they rushed the door. Spirlaw sprang back, trying to close it after him. Instead, a dozen hands grasped and half wrenched it from its hinges. " Lie down on the floor, Spirlaw, quick !" It was Keating's voice, punctuated with a cough. The next instant his gun barked, playing through the doorway like a Gatling. From the door the road boss joined in. The mob wavered, pitched, swaying this way and that, then broke and ran, struggling with each other to get out of the line of fire. " Hurrah !" cried Keating. " I guess that will hold them." " 'Tain't begun," was Spirlaw's grim response. " Where's them cartridges? "" On the table. Got them? "" Yes," said Spirlaw, after a minute's groping. " Here, put a box in your pocket." " What are they up to now? " asked Keating, as, in the silence that had fallen, they reloaded and listened. " God knows," growled Spirlaw. " But I guess we'll find out quick enough." As he spoke, from a little distance away came the splintering crash of woodwork, then silence again. " That's the storehouse," Spirlaw snarled. " They're after the bars and anything else they can lay hands on. Guess they weren't counting on our having anything more than our fists to fight with. Guess they weren't." Keating's only reply was a cough. The minutes passed, 2, 3, 5 of them. Once outside sounded what might have been the stealthy scuffle of feet, or only a storm sound so construed by the imagination. Then, from the direction of the river bed, sudden, sharp, came a terrific roar. " My God !" yelled Spirlaw. " That's the trestle gone. They've blown it up. They're sure to have laid a fuse here, too. Get out of here quick. Fool that I was, I might have known it was the dynamite they was after." Both men were scrambling for the door as he spoke. They reached it not an instant too soon. The ground behind them lifted, heaved, and the walls, the roof of the shack rose, cracked like egg shells, and scattered in flying pieces, and the mighty deafening detonation of the explosion echoed up and down the gorge, echoed again, and died away. The mob caught sight of them as they ran, and, foiled for the moment, set up a yell of rage, then started in pursuit. " Make for the cut !" shouted Spirlaw. " We can hold them off there behind the rocks." Keating had no breath for words. Panting, sick, his head swimming, a fleck of blood upon his lips, he struggled after the giant form of the road boss, while behind, coming ever closer, ringing in his ears, were the wild cries of the maddened Polacks. The splash of water revived him a little as they plunged along the old right of way where the river, flooded by the storm, had again claimed its own. The worst of it was up to his armpits. A grip on his shoulder and a pull from Spirlaw helped him over. They gained the other side with a bare 2 yards separating them from the mob behind, went on again, and then Spirlaw caught his foot, tripped, and pitched headlong, causing Keating, at his heels, to stumble and fall over him. Like wild beasts the Polacks surged upon them. Keating tried to regain his feet, but he got no further than his knees as a swinging blow from a pick handle caught him on the head. Half stunned, he sank back, and as consciousness left him, he heard Spirlaw's great voice roar out like the maddened bellow of a bull, saw the giant form rise, with, it seemed, a dozen Polacks clinging to neck and shoulders, legs and body, saw him shake them off, and the massive arms rise and fall, and all was a blur, all darkness. The road boss lay stretched out a yard away from him when he opened his eyes. He was very weak. He raised himself on his elbow. From the camp down the line he could see the lights at the bunkhouses, hear drunken, chorused shouts. He crawled to Spirlaw, called him, shook him. The big road boss never moved. The Polacks had evidently left both of them for dead, and one, it seemed, was. He slid his hand inside the other's vest for the heartbeat. So faint it was at first he could not feel it. Then he got it, and realizing that Spirlaw was still alive, he straightened up and looked helplessly around. And, in a flash, like the knell of doom, Spirlaw's words came back to him: " There's the trestle gone." Sick the boy was with his clotting lungs, deathly sick, weak from the blow on his head, dizzy, and his brain swam. " There's the trestle gone." He coughed it out between blue lips. " There's the trestle gone." Keefer's Siding was a mile away. Somehow he must reach it, must get the word along the line that the trestle was out, get the word along before the stalled traffic moved, before the first train, east or west, crashed through to death, before more wreck and ruin was added to the tale that had gone before. He bent to Spirlaw's ear and 3 times called him frantically: " Spirlaw! Spirlaw! Spirlaw!" There was no response. He tried to lift him, tried to drag him. The great bulk was far beyond his strength. And the minutes were flying by, each marking the one perhaps when it would be too late to warn anyone that the trestle was out. Just up past the rock cut, a bare 20 yards away, where the leads to the temporary track swung into the straight of the main line, was the platform handcar that was used for carrying tools and the odds and ends of supplies between the storehouse and the work. If he could only get Spirlaw there! He called him again, shook him, breathing a prayer for help. The road boss stirred, raised himself a little, and sank down again with a moan. Spirlaw! Spirlaw, for God's sake, man, try to get up. I'll help you. You must, do you hear? You must. He was dragging at the road boss's collar. Keating's voice seemed to reach the other's consciousness, for weakly, dazed, without sense, blindly, Spirlaw got upon his knees, then to his feet, and staggering, reeled like a drunken man, his arm around Keating's neck, his weight almost crushing to the ground the one sicker than himself. The two stumbled, pitched, and at the end crawled those 20 yards. " The handcar, Spirlaw, the handcar! " gasped Keating. " Get on it! You must! Try! Try! " Spirlaw straightened, lurched forward, and half fell across the car with outflung arms, unconscious again. The rest Keating managed somehow, enough so that the dangling legs freed the ground by a few inches. Then, with bursting lungs, far spent, he unblocked the wheel, pushed the car down the little spur, swung the switch, dragged himself aboard, and began to pump his way west toward Keefer's Siding. No man may tell the details of that mile, every inch of which was wrung from blood that oozed from parted, quivering lips. No man may question from whom came the strength to the frail body, where strength was not, the reprieve to the broken lungs that long since should have done their worst. Only Keating knew that the years were ended forever, that with every stroke of the pump handle the time was shorter. The few minutes to win through, that was the last stake. At the end he choked, fighting for his consciousness. As, like dancing points, switch lights swam before him, he checked with the brake, reeled from the car, fell, tried to rise, and fell back again. Then, on his hands and knees, he crept toward the station door. It had come at last. The hemorrhage that he had fought back with all his strength was upon him. He beat upon the door. It opened, a lantern was flashed upon him, and he fell inside. " The trestle's out at the Glacier. Hold trains both ways. Polacks, Spirlaw, handcar. That was all. Keating never spoke again. " I don't know as I'd call him a builder," says Clarihue, the night turner, when he tells the story in the darkened roundhouse in the shadow of the big 10-wheelers on the pits, while the steam purrs softly at the gauges and sometimes a pop valve lifts with a catchy sob. " I don't know as you would. It depends on the way you look at it. According to him, he was. He left something behind him. What? End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of On the Iron at Big Cloud by Frank L. Packard. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Chapter 7 The Guardian of the Devil's Slide. There is one bad piece of track on the Hill Division, particularly bad, which is the same as saying that it is the worst piece of track, bar none, on the American continent. Not that the engineers were to blame, they weren't. It was Dame Nature in the shape of the Rockies, Dame Nature and the directors. Sir Ivers Clayborne, gray-haired and grizzled, a man schooled in the practical school of many lands and many years, who was chief consulting engineer when the road was building, advised a double-looped tunnel that, according to his sketch, looked something like the figure 8 canted over sideways. The directors poised their glasses and examined the sketch with interest until they caught sight of the penciled estimate in the corner. That settled it. They did not even take the trouble to vote. They asked for an alternative, and they got it. They got the Devil's Slide. First and last, it has euchred more money out of the treasury of the Transcontinental than it would have taken to build things Sir Ivor's way to begin with, and it has taken some years, a good many of them, for the directors to learn their lesson. The old board never did, for that matter, but thanks perhaps to younger blood, they've begun now to build as they should have built in the first place. It isn't finished yet, that double loop tunnel, it won't be for years. But no matter, it's begun, and some day a good many more than a few men will sleep the easier because of it. From Carleton, the super, to the last section hand and track walker, the Devil's Slide was a nightmare. The dispatchers, under their green shaded lamps, cursed it in the gray hours of dawn, the traffic department cursed it spasmodically, but at such times so wholeheartedly and with such genuine fervor and abandon that its occasional lapses into silence were overlooked. The motive power department, in the shape of Regan, the master mechanic, cursed it all the time, and did it breathlessly. It had only one friend, the passenger agents department. The passenger agents department swore by it, on account of the scenery. Scenery, gulped the dispatchers, and the white showed under their nail tips as their fingers tightened on their keys. Scenery, howled the traffic department and reached for the claim file. Scenery, Regan didn't say it, he choked, just choked and spat the exclamation point in a stream of blackstrap. Scenery, murmured Mr. General Passenger Agent aesthetically, waving a soft and diamond bedecked hand from the platform of Carleton's private car. Wonderful, grand, magnificent. We've got them all beaten into a coma. No other road has anything like it anywhere in the world. They have not, agreed Carleton, and the bitterness of his soul was in his words. Everybody was right. The general passenger agent was right, the scenic grandeur was beyond compare, and he made the most of it in booklets, in leaflets, in pamphlets, and in a score of pages in a score of different magazines. The others were right. The Devil's Slide was everything that the ethics of engineering said it shouldn't be. It was neither level nor straight. In its marvelous 2 miles from the summit of the pass to the canyon below, its nearest approach to the ethical was 3% drop. There wasn't much of that. Most of it was a straight 5. It twisted, it turned, it slid, it slithered, and it dove around projecting mountainsides at scandalous tangents and with indecent abruptness. Chick Coogan swore, with a grin, that he could see his own headlight coming at him about half the time every trip he made up or down. That, of course, is exaggerating a little, but not much. Coogan sized up the Devil's Slide pretty well when he said that, all things considered, pretty well, there wasn't much chance to mistake what he meant, or what the Devil's Slide was, or what he thought of it. Anyway, be that as it may, Coogan's description gave the division the only chance they ever had to crack a smile when the Devil's Slide was in question. They smiled then, those railroaders of the Rockies, but they'll look at you queerly now if you mention the two together, Coogan and the Devil's Slide. Fate is a pretty grim player sometimes. Any one on the Hill Division can tell you the story. They've reason to know it, and they do, to the last man. If you'd rather get it first hand in a roundhouse or between trains from the operator at some lone station that's no more than a siding, or in the caboose of a way freight, if you are a big enough man to ride there, and that means being bigger than most men, or anywhere your choice or circumstance leads you from the super's office to a track walker's shanty, if you'd rather get it that way, and you'll get it better, far better than you will here, don't try any jolly business to make the boys talk. Just say a good word for Coogan, Chick Coogan. That's the open sesame, and the only one. There's no use talking about the logical or the illogical, the rational or the irrational, when it comes to Coogan's story. Coogan's story is just Coogan's story. That's all there is to it. What one man does another doesn't. You can't cancel the human equation because there's nothing to cancel it with. It's there all the time, swaying, compelling, dominating every act in a man's life. The higher branches of mathematics go far, and to some men 3 dimensions are but elemental, but there is one problem even they have never solved and never will solve the human equation. What Coogan did you might not do, or you might. Coogan didn't come to the Transcontinental a full-blown engineer from some other road, as a good many of the boys have, though that's nothing against them. Coogan was a product of the Hill Division, pure and simple. He began as a kid almost before the steel was spiked home, and certainly before the right of way was shaken down enough to begin to look like business. He started at the bottom and he went up, call boy, sweeper, wiper, fireman, one after the other. Promotion came fast in the early days, for the Rockies once bridged business came fast too, and Coogan had his engine at 21, and at 24 he was pulling the Imperial Limited. " Good goods," said Regan. " That's what he is, the best ever." Nobody questioned that, not only because there was no one in the division who could put anything over Coogan in a cab, but also because, and perhaps even more pertinent a reason, everyone liked Coogan. Some of them did more than that. Straight as a string, clean as a whistle was Coogan, 6 feet in his stockings, with a body that played up to every inch of his height, black hair, jet black, black eyes that laughed with you, never at you, a smile and a cheery nod always, the kind of man who makes you feel every time you see them that the world isn't such an internal dismal grind after all. That was Chick Coogan, all except his heart. Coogan had a heart like a woman's, and a hard luck story from a beau stealing a ride, a railroad man, or anyone else for that matter, never failed to make him poorer by a generous percentage of what happened to be in his pocket at the time. Who wouldn't like him? Queer how things happen. It was the day Coogan got married that Regan gave him the 505 and the Limited run as a sort of wedding present, and that night Big Cloud turned itself completely inside out, doing honor and justice to the occasion. Big Cloud has had other celebrations before and since, but none quite so unanimous as that one. Restraint never did run an overwhelmingly strong favorite with the town, but that night it was hung up higher than the arms on the telegraph poles. Men that the community used to hide behind and push forward as hostages of righteousness, when it was on its good behavior and wanted to put on a front, cut loose and outshone the best, or the worst, if you like that better, of the crowd that never made any bones about being on the other side of the fence. They burned red flares, very many of them, that Carleton neglected to imagine had any connection with the storekeeper and the supply account. They committed indiscretions, mostly of a liquid nature, that anyone but the trainmaster, who was temporarily blind in both eyes, could have seen, and as a result the Hill Division the next day was an eminently paralytic and feeble affair. This is a very general description of the event, because sometimes it is not wise to particularize. This is a case in point. Coogan's send-off was a send-off no other man, be he king, prince, president, shogun, or high mucky-muck of whatever degree, could have got, except Coogan. Coogan got it because he was Coogan, just Coogan, and the night was a night to wonder at. Regan summarized it the next evening over the usual game of Pedro with Carleton upstairs over the station in the super's office. " Apart from Coogan and me," said the master mechanic in a voice that was still suspiciously husky, " apart from Coogan and me, and maybe the minister " the rest was a wave of his hand. Regan could wave his hand with a wealth of eloquence that was astounding. " Quite so," agreed Carleton with a grin. " Too bad to drag them into it, though. Both Peds to me, Tommy. It's a good thing for the discipline of the division that bigamy is against the law, what? "" They'll be talking of it," said Regan reminiscently, " when you and me are on the scrap heap, Carleton." " I guess that's right," admitted the super. " Play on, Tommy." But it wasn't. They only talked of Coogan's wedding for about a year. No, they don't talk about it now. We'll get to that presently. The Imperial Limited was the star run on the division. Regan gave Coogan the 33rd degree when he gave him that and the 505, which was the last word in machine design. And Coogan took them and the schedule rights that pertained thereto, which were a clear and a clean swept track, and day after day, up hill and down, Number One or Number Two, as the case might be, pulled into division on the dot. Coogan's stock soared, if that were possible, but not Coogan. The youngest engineer on the road, and top of them all, would have been excuse enough for him to show his oats, and, within decent limits, no one would have thought the worse of him for it. Coogan never turned a hair. He was still the friend of the beau and the man in trouble, still the Coogan that had been a wiper in the roundhouse, and yet perhaps not quite the same, for two new loves had come into his life, his love for Annie Coogan, and his love, the love of the master craftsman, for 505. In the little house at home he talked to Annie of the big mountain racer, and Annie, being an engineer's daughter as well as an engineer's wife, listened with understanding and a smile. And in the smile was pride and love. In the cab Coogan talked of Annie, always Annie, and one day he told his fireman a secret that made Big Jim Dahleen grin sheepishly and stick out a grimy paw. Fate is a pretty grim player sometimes, and always, it seems, the cards are stacked. The days and the weeks and the months went by, and then there came a morning when a sober, serious-faced group of men stood gathered in the super's office as Number Two's whistle, in from the eastbound run, sounded down the gorge. They looked at Regan. Slowly the master mechanic turned, went out of the room and down the stairs to the platform as 505 shot round the bend and rolled into the station. For a moment Regan looked irresolute, then he started for the front end. He went no further than the colonist coach that was coupled behind the mail car. Here he stopped, made a step forward, changed his mind, climbed over the colonist's platform, dropped down on the other side of the track, and began to walk toward the roundhouse. They changed engines at Big Cloud, and 505, already uncoupled, was scooting up for the spur to back down for the table. The soles of Regan's boots seemed like plates of lead as he went along, and he mopped his forehead nervously. There was a general air of desertion about the roundhouse. The table was set and ready for 505, but there wasn't a soul in sight. Regan nodded to himself in sympathetic understanding. He crossed the turntable, walked around the half circle, and entered the roundhouse through the engine doors by the far pit, the one next to that which belonged to 505. Here, just inside, he waited, as the big mogul came slowly down the track, took the table with a slight jolt, and stopped. He saw Coogan, big, brawny, swing out of the cab like an athlete, and then he heard the engineer speak to his fireman. " Looks like a graveyard around here, Jim. Wonder where the boys are. I won't wait to swing the table. They'll be around in a minute, I guess. I want to get up to the little woman." " All right," Dahleen answered. " Leave it to me. I'll run her in. Good luck to you, chick." Coogan was starting across the yards with a stride that was almost a run. Regan opened his mouth to shout, and swallowed a lump in his throat instead. Twice he made as though to follow the engineer, and twice something stronger than himself held him back, and then, as though he had been a thief, the master mechanic stole out from behind the doors, went back across the tracks, climbed the stairs to Carleton's room with lagging steps, and entered. The rest were still there. Carleton in his swivel chair, Harvey, the division engineer, Spence, the chief dispatcher, and Riley, the trainmaster. Regan shook his head and dropped into a seat. " I couldn't," he said in a husky voice. " My God, I couldn't," he repeated, and swept out his arms. A bitter oath sprang from Carleton's lips, lips that were not often profane, and his teeth snapped through the amber of his briar. The others just looked out of the window. McVicker, a spare man, took the Limited out that night, and it was 3 days before Coogan reported again. Maybe it was the fit of the black store clothes, and perhaps the coat didn't hang just right, but as he entered the roundhouse he didn't look as straight as he used to look, and there was a queer inward slope to his shoulders, and he walked like a man who didn't see anything. The springy swing through the gangway was gone. He climbed to the cab as an old man climbs, painfully. The boys hung back and didn't say anything, just swore under their breaths with full hearts as men do. There wasn't anything to say, nothing that would do any good. Coogan took 505 and the Limited out that night, took it out the night after and the nights that followed, only he didn't talk any more, and the slope of the shoulders got a little more pronounced, a little more noticeable, a little beyond the cut of any coat. And on the afternoons of the layovers at Big Cloud, Coogan walked out behind the town to where on the slope of the butte were two fresh mounds, one larger than the other. That was all. Regan, short, paunchy, big-hearted Regan, tackled Jim Dahleen, Coogan's fireman. " What's he say on the run, Jim?
He ain't talkative,"
Dahleen answered shortly. " What the hell? " growled the master mechanic, deep in his throat to conceal his emotion. " 'Tain't doing him any good going up there afternoons. God knows it's natural enough, but 'tain't doing him any good. Not a mite. Nor them either, as far as I can see, You got to make him talk, Jim. Wake him up."
" Why don't you talk to him? "
demanded the fireman. Yes, so I will. I sure will," Regan answered. And he meant to, honestly. But somehow Coogan's eyes and Coogan's face said no to him as they did to every other man, and as the days passed, almost a month of them, Regan shook his head, perplexed and troubled, for he was fond of Coogan. Then one night it happened. Regan and Carleton were alone over their Pedro at headquarters, except for Spence, the dispatcher, in the next room. It was getting close on to 11:30. The Imperial Limited, westbound with Coogan in the cab, had pulled out on time an hour and a half before. The game was lagging, and, as usual, the conversation had got round to the engineer, introduced, as it always was, by the master mechanic. " I sure don't know what to do for the boy," said he. " I'd like to do something. Talking don't amount to anything, does it? Even if you can talk. I can't talk to him. What? "" A man's got to work a thing like that out for himself, Tommy," Carleton answered. " And it takes time. That's the only thing that will ever help him, time. I know you're pretty fond of Coogan, even more than the rest of us, and that's saying a good deal, but you're thinking too much about it yourself." Regan shook his head. " I can't help it, Carleton. It's got me. Time and that sort of thing may be all right, but it ain't very promising when a man broods the way he does. I ain't superstitious or anything like that, but I've a feeling I can't just explain that somehow something's going to break. Kind of premonition. Ever have anything like that? It gets on your mind and you can't shake it off. It's on me to night, worse than it's ever been." " Nonsense," Carleton laughed. " Premonitions are out of date because they've been traced back to their origin. Out here I should say it was a case of too much of Dutchy's Lutch counter pie. You ought to diet anyway, Tommy, you're getting too fat. Hand over that fine cut of yours. He stopped as a sharp cry came from the dispatcher's room, followed by an instant's silence. Then the crash of a chair sounded as, hastily pushed back, it fell to the floor. Quick steps echoed across the room, and the next moment Spence, with a white face and holding a sheet of tissue in his hand, burst in upon them. Carleton sprung to his feet. " What's the matter, Spence? " he demanded sharply. " Number One," the dispatcher jerked out, and extended the sheet on which he had scribbled the message as it came off the sounder. Carleton snatched the paper, and Regan, leaping from his chair, looked over his shoulder. Number 1, engine 505, jumped track east of switchback number 2 in Devil's Slide. Report 3 known to be killed, others missing. Engineer Coogan and fireman Dahleen both hurt, they read. Carleton was ever the man of action, and his voice rang hard as chilled steel. " Clear the line, Spence. Get your relief and wrecker out at once. Wire Dreamer Butte for their wrecker as well, so we can work from both ends. Now then, Tommy, my God, what's the matter with you? Are you crazy? " Regan was leaning over the back of his chair, his face strained, his arm outstretched, finger pointing to the wall. " I knew it," he muttered hoarsely. " I knew it. That's what it is." Carleton's eyes traveled from the master mechanic to the wall and back again in amazed bewilderment. Then he shook Regan by the shoulder. " That's what is? " he questioned brusquely. " Are you mad, man? "" The date," whispered Regan, still pointing to where a large single day calendar with big figures on it hung behind the super's desk. " It's the 28th." " I don't know what you mean, Tommy." Carleton's voice was quiet, restrained. " Mean? " Regan burst out with a hard laugh. " I don't mean anything, do I? 'Tain't anything to do with it. It's just coincidence, maybe, and maybe it's not. It was a year ago tonight Coogan was married." For a moment Carleton did not speak. Like Regan, he stared at the wall. "You think that—" "No, I don't." Regan caught him up roughly. "I don't think anything at all. I only know it's queer, ghastly queer." Carleton nodded his head slowly. Steps were coming up the stairs. The voice of Flannagan, the wrecking boss, reached them. Other voices, excited and loud, joined in. He slapped the master mechanic on the back. " I don't wonder it caught you, Tommy," he said. " It's almost creepy. But there's no time for that now. Come on." Regan laughed the same hard laugh as he followed the chief into the dispatcher's room. " He's the No. 2 switchback, he swore. " If there's any chance for hellishness anywhere on that cursed stretch of track, that's it. My God, it's come, and it's come good and hard. Good and hard." It had. It was a bad mess, a nasty mess, but like everything else it might have been worse. Instead of plunging to the right and dropping to the canon 1,800 feet below, 505 chose the inward side and rammed her nose into the gray mass of rock that made the mountain wall. The wreckers from Dreamer Butte and the wreckers from Big Cloud tell of it to this day. For 24 hours they worked, and then they dropped, and fresh men took their places. There was no room to work, just the narrow ledge of the right of way on a circular sweep with the jutting cliff of old Piebald Mountain sticking in between, hiding one of the gangs from the other, and around which the big wrecking cranes groped dangling arms and chains like fishers angling for a bite. It was a mauled and tangled snarl, and the worst of it went over the canyon's edge in pieces, as axes, sledges, wedges, bars, and cranes ripped and tore their way to the heart of it. And as they worked, those hard-faced, grimy, sweating men of the wrecking crews, they wondered that anyone had come out of it alive. Back at headquarters in Big Cloud they wondered at it too, and they wondered also at the cause. Everyone that by any possible chance could throw any light upon it went on the carpet in the super's office. Everybody testified, everybody except Dahleen the fireman and Coogan the engineer, and they didn't testify because they couldn't. Coogan was in the hospital with queer, inconsequential words upon his tongue and a welt across his forehead that had laid bare the bone from eye to the hairline of his skull. And Dahleen was there also, not so bad, just generally jellied up, but still too bad to talk, and the testimony was of little use. The tender of switchback No. 1 reported that the Limited had passed him at perhaps a little greater speed than usual, which was the speed of a man's walk, for the trains crawl down the Devil's Slide with fear and caution, but not fast enough to cause him to think anything about it. Hardy, the conductor, testified. Hardy said it was the air, that the train began to slide faster and faster after the first switchback was passed, and that her speed kept on increasing up to the moment that the crash came. He figured that it couldn't be anything else, just the air. It wouldn't work, and the control of the train was lost. That was all he knew. And while Regan swore and fumed, Carleton's face set grim and hard, and he waited for Dahleen. It was a week before the fireman faced Carleton across the super's desk, but when the time came Carleton opened on him straight from the shoulder, not even a word of sympathy, not so much as glad to see you're out again, just straight to the point, hard and quick. " Dahleen," he snapped, " I want to know what happened in the cab that night, and I want a straight story. No other kind of talking will do you any good." Dahleen's face, white with the pallor of his illness, flushed suddenly red. " You're jumping a man pretty hard, aren't you, Mr. Carleton? " he said resentfully. " Maybe I've reason to," replied Carleton. " Well, I'm waiting for that story." " There is no story that I know of," said Dahleen evenly. " When we passed the switchback No. 1 we lost control of the train. The air wouldn't work." " Do you expect me to believe that? "" You don't seem to," retorted Dahleen, with a set jaw. " What did you do to stop her? "" What I could," said Dahleen, with terse finality. Carleton sprang to his feet and his fist crashed down upon the desk. " You are lying !" he thundered. " That wreck and the lives that are lost are at your door, and if I could prove it " he shook his fist at the fireman. " As it is, I can only fire you for violation of the rules. I thought at first it was Coogan and that he'd gone off his head a bit, and you are cur enough to let the blame go there if you could, to let me and every other man think so." Dahleen's fists clenched and he took a step forward.
" That's enough !" he cried hoarsely. " Enough from you or any other man."
Carleton rounded on him more furiously than before. " I've given you a chance to tell a straight story and you wouldn't. God knows what you did that night. I believe you were fighting drunk. I believe that gash in Coogan's head wasn't from the wreck. If I knew, I'd fix you." He wrenched open a drawer of his desk, whipped out a metal whisky flask, and shook it before Dahleen's eyes. " When you were picked up, this was in the pocket of your jumper." The color fled from Dahleen's face, leaving it whiter than when he had entered the room. He wet his lips with the tip of his tongue. All the bluster, all the fight was gone. He stared mutely, a startled, frightened look in his eyes at the damning evidence in the super's hand. " Forgotten about it, had you? " Carleton flung out. " Well, have you anything to say? " Dahleen shook his head.
" Ain't anything to say, is there? "
His voice was low, with just a hint of the former defiance.
" It's mine, but you can't prove anything. You can't prove I drank it. You think I'd be fool enough to do anything but keep my mouth shut? "" No, I can prove it." Carleton's voice was deadly cold. " You're out. I'll give you 12 hours to get out of the mountains. The boys, for Coogan's sake alone if for no other, would tear you to pieces if they knew the story. No one knows it yet but the man who found this in your pocket and myself. I'm not going to tell you again what I think of you. Get out." Dahleen, without a word, swung slowly on his heel and started for the door. " Wait," said Carleton suddenly. " Here's a pass East for you. I don't want your blood on my hands, as I would have if Coogan's friends, and that's every last soul out here, got hold of you. You've got 12 hours. After that they'll know to set Coogan straight." Dahleen hesitated, came back, took the slip of paper with a mirthless, half choked laugh, turned again, and the door closed behind him. Dahleen was out. Carleton kept his word, 12 hours, and then from the division rose a cry like the cry of savage beasts. But Regan was like a madman. " Curse him !" he swore bitterly, breaking into a seething torrent of oaths. " What did you let him go for, Carleton? You've no business to. You should have held him until Coogan could talk, and then we'd have him." " Tommy," Carleton laid his hand quietly on the master mechanic's shoulder, " we're too young out in this country for much law. I don't think Coogan knows or ever will know again what happened in the cab that night. The doctors don't seem quite able to call the turn on him themselves, so they've said to you and said to me. But whether he does or not, it doesn't make any difference as far as Dahleen goes. It would have been murder to keep him here, and if Coogan ever can talk he'll never put a mate in bad, no matter what the consequences to himself. There's nothing against Dahleen except that he had liquor in his possession while on duty. That's what I fired him for. That's the only story that's gone out of this office. You and I and the rest are free to put the construction on it that suits us best, and there it ends. If I was wrong to let him go, I was wrong. I did what I thought was right. That's all I can ever do." " Maybe," growled Regan. " Maybe. But damn him, he ought to be murdered. I'd like to have had him done it. It's that smash on the head put Coogan to the bad. You're right about one thing, I guess. He'll never be the same Coogan again." And in a way this was so. In another it wasn't. It was not the wound that was to blame, the doctors were positive about that. But Coogan, it was pitifully evident, was not the same. Physically, at the end of a month, he left the hospital apparently as well as he had ever been in his life. But mentally, somewhere, a cog had slipped. His brain seemed warped and weakened, simple as a child's in its workings. His memory fogged and dazed, full of indefinite, intangible snatches, vague, indeterminate glimpses of his life before. One thing seemed to cling to him, to predominate, to sway him the Devil's Slide. Regan and Carleton talked to him, trying to guide his thoughts and stimulate his memory. " You remember you used to drive an engine, don't you, Chick? " asked Carleton. "Engine?" Coogan nodded. "Yes, in the Devil's Slide. 505, said Regan quickly. You know old 505. Coogan shook his head. Carleton tried another trick. You were in a bad accident, Coogan, one night. You were in the cab of the engine when she went to smash. Do you remember that? The smash was on Devil's Slide, said Coogan. That's it, cried Carleton. I knew you'd remember. They're always there, said Coogan simply. Always there. It is a bad track. I'm a railroad man, and I know it's not properly guarded. I'm going to work there, take care of it. Work there, said Regan, the tears almost in his eyes. What kind of work? What do you want to do, Chick? Just work there, said Coogan. Take care of the Devil's Slide. The super and the master mechanic looked at each other and averted their eyes. Then they took Coogan up to his boarding house, where he had moved after Annie and the little one died. He'll never put a finger on a throttle again, said Regan with a choke in his voice as they came out. The best man that ever pulled a latch, the best man that ever drew a paycheck on the Hill Division. It's hell, Carleton, that's what it is. I don't think he really knew you or me. He don't seem to remember much of anything, though he's natural enough and able enough to take care of himself in all other ways. Just kind of simple like. It's queer the way the Devil's Slide has got him, that? We can't let him go out there. I wonder if he remembers Annie, said Carleton. I was afraid to ask him. I don't know what effect it might have. No, we can't let him go out on Devil's Slide. But the doctors said yes. They went further and said it was about the only chance he had. The thing was on his mind. It was better to humor him, and that, with the outdoor mountain life, in time might bring him around again. And so, while Regan growled and swore and Carleton knitted his brows in perplexed protest, the doctors had their way, and Coogan, Chick Coogan, went to the Devil's Slide. Officially he was on the payroll as a section hand, but Milray, the section boss, had his own orders. Let Coogan alone, let him do what he likes, only see that he doesn't come to any harm, wired the super. And Coogan, when Milray asked him what he wanted to do, answered simply, I'm going to take care of the Devil's Slide. All right, Chick, the section boss agreed cheerily. It's up to you. Fire ahead. At first no one understood, perhaps even at the end no one quite understood, possibly Coogan least of all. He may have done some good, or he may not. In time they came to call him the guardian of the Devil's Slide, not slightingly, but as strong men talk, defiant of ridicule, with a gruff ring of assertion in their tones that brooked no question. Up and down, down and up, 2 miles east, 2 miles west, Coogan patrolled the Devil's Slide, and never a weakened rail, a sunken tie, a loosened spike escaped him. He may have done some good, or he may not. He slept here and there in one of the switchback tender's shanties, moved and governed by no other consideration than fatigue. Day and night were as things apart. He ate with them, too, and scrupulously he paid his footing, 25 cents for a meal, 25 cents for a bunk, or a blanket on the floor. They took his money because he forced it upon them, furiously angry at a hint of refusal, but mostly the coin would be slipped back unnoticed into the pocket of Coogan's coat. Poor men and rough they were, nothing of veneer, nothing of polish, grimy, overalled, horny-fisted toilers. Their hearts were big if their purses weren't. At all hours, in the early dawn, at midday or late afternoon, the train crews and the engine crews on passengers, specials and freights, passed Coogan up and down, always walking with his head bent forward, his eyes fastened on the right of way, passed with a cheery hail and the flirt of a hand from cab, caboose, or the ornate tail of a garish Pullman. And to the tourists he came to be more of an attraction than the scenic grandeur of the Rockies themselves. They stared from the observation car and listened with a running fire of wondering comment as the brass buttons swelled with importance colored porters told the story, until at last to have done the Rockies and have missed the guardian of the Devil's Slide was to have done them not at all. It was natural enough, anything out of the ordinary ministers to and arouses the public's curiosity. Not very nice, perhaps, no, but natural. The railroad men didn't like it, and that was natural, too, but their feelings or opinions in the very nature of things had little effect one way or the other. Coogan grew neither better nor worse. The months passed, and he grew neither better nor worse. Winter came, and with the trestle that went out in the big storm that year, Coogan went into division for the last time, went over the Great Divide, the same simple, broken-minded Coogan that had begun his self-appointed task in the spring. He may have done some good, or he may not. They found him after 2 or 3 days and sent him back to Big Cloud. He'd have chosen that himself if he could have chosen, said Carleton soberly. God knows what the end would have been. The years would have been all alike. He'd never have got his mind back. It's all for the best, what? Regan did not answer. Philosophy and the master mechanic's heart did not always measure things alike. The Brotherhood took charge of the arrangements, and Coogan's funeral was the biggest funeral Big Cloud ever had. Everybody wanted to march, so they held the service late in the afternoon and closed down the shops at 4:30, and the shop hands, from the boss fitter to the water boy, turned out to the last man, and so did everyone else in town. It was getting dark and already supper time when it was over, but Carleton, who had left some unfinished work on his desk, went back to his office instead of going home. He lighted the lamp put on the chimney, but the match was still burning between his fingers when the door opened, and a man, with his hat pulled far down over his face, stepped in and closed it behind him. Carleton whirled around, the match dropped to the floor, and he leaned forward over his desk, a hard look settling on his face. The man had pushed back his hat. It was Dahleen, Coogan's fireman, Jim Dahleen. For a moment neither man spoke. Bitter words arose to Carleton's tongue, but something in the other's face checked and held them back. It was Dahleen who spoke first. " I heard about Chick, that he'd gone out," he said quietly. " I don't suppose it did him any good, but I kind of had to chip in on the goodbye. Chick and me used to be pretty thick. I saw you come down here, and I followed you. Don't stare at me like that. You'd have done the same. Have you got that flask yet? "" Yes," Carleton answered mechanically, and as mechanically produced it from the drawer of his desk. " Ever examine it particularly? "" Examine it?
I guess that answers my question. I was afraid you might, and I wanted to ask you for it that day, only I thought you'd think it mighty funny, refuse, and well, get to looking it over on your own hook. Will you give it here for a minute? " Carleton handed it over silently. Dahleen took it, pulled off the lower half that served as drinking cup, laid his finger on the inside rim, and returned it to the super. Carleton moved nearer to the flask, then his face paled. It was Coogan's flask! The inscription, a little dulled in the fine engraving, was still plain enough: "To Chick from Jim on the occasion of his wedding." Carleton's hand was trembling as he set it down. " My God," he said hoarsely, " it was Coogan that was drunk that night, not you." " I figured that's the way you'd read it, you or any other railroad man," said Dahleen. " It was him or me, and one of us was drunk, in the eyes of any of the boys on the road, from the minute that flask showed up. There was only one thing that would have made you believe different, and I couldn't tell you then. I'd have taken the same stand you did. But you're wrong. Coogan wasn't drunk that night. He never touched a drop. I wouldn't be telling you this now if he had, would I? "" Sit down," said Carleton. Dahleen took the chair beside the desk, and resting his feet on the window sill, stared out at the lights twinkling below him. " Yes, I gave him the flask," he said slowly, as though picking up the thread of a story, " for a wedding present. The day he came back to his run after the little woman and the baby died, he had it in his pocket and he handed it to me. ' I'm afraid of it, Jimmy,' he said. That was all, just that, only he looked at me. Then he got down out of the cab to oil round, me still holding it in my hand, for the words kind of hit me. They meant a whole lot. Well, before he came back, I lifted up my seat and chucked it down in the box underneath. I don't want to make a long story of this. You know how he took to brooding. Sometimes he wouldn't say a word from one end of the run to the other, and once in a while he seemed to act a little queer. I didn't think much of it, and I didn't say anything to anybody, figured it'd wear off. When we pulled out of Big Cloud the night of the wreck, I didn't see anything out of the ordinary about him. I'd kind of got used to him by then, and if there was any difference, I didn't notice it. He never said a word all the way out until we hit the summit of the Devil's Slide and started down. I had the firebox door open and was throwing coal when he says so suddenly as almost to make me jump my shovel, "Jimmy, do you know what night this is?" "Sure," says I, never thinking, "it's Thursday." He laughed kind of soft-like to himself. "It's my wedding night, Jimmy," he says. "My wedding night, and we're going to celebrate." The light from the firebox was full on his face, and he had the queerest look you ever saw in a man. He was white, and his eyes were staring, and he was pushing his hand through his hair and rocking in his seat. I was scared. I thought for a minute he was going to faint. Then I remembered that whiskey, and jumped from my side of the cab, opened the seat, and snatched it up. I went back to him with it in my hand. I don't think he ever saw it. I know he didn't. He was laughing that soft laugh again, kind of as though he was crooning, and he reached out his hand and pushed me away. "We're going to celebrate, Jimmy," says he again. "We're going to celebrate. It's my wedding night." I felt the speed quicken a bit. We were on the slide then, you know, and I saw his fingers tightening on the throttle. Then it got me, and my heart went into my mouth. Chick was clean off his head. I slipped the flask into my pocket and tried to coax his hands away from the throttle. "Let me take her a spell, Chick," says I, thinking my best chance was to humor him. He threw me off like I was a plaything. Then I tried to pull him away, and he smashed me one between the eyes and sent me to the floor. And all the time we was going faster and faster. I tackled him again, but I might as well have been a baby. And then, well, that wound in his head came from a long-handled union wrench I grabbed out of the toolbox. He went down like a felled ox, but it was too late. Before I could reach a lever, we were in splinters. Dahleen stopped. Carleton never stirred. He was leaning forward, his elbows on his desk, his chin in his hands, his face strained, eyes intently fastened on the other. Dahleen fumbled a second with his watch chain, twisting it around his fingers. Then he went on. "While I laid in the hospital, I turned the thing over in my mind pretty often, long before the doctors thought I knew my own name again. And I figured that if it was ever known, old Coogan was down and out for fair, even if when he got better his head turned out all right again, because he wouldn't be ever trusted in a cab under any circumstances, you understand? If he didn't come out straight, why, that ended it, of course. And I had it in my mind that it was only what they call a temporary aberration. I couldn't queer him if that was all, could I? So I said to myself, Jimmy, all you know is that the air wouldn't work. That's what I told you that day, and then you sprang that flask on me. You were right, I had forgotten it. Whiskey in the cab on the night of an accident is pretty near an open and shut game. It was him or me, and I couldn't tell you the story then without doing Coogan cold. But Coogan's gone now, and it can't hurt him. That's all." The tick of the clock on the wall, the click of the sounder from the dispatcher's room next door, were the only sounds for a long minute. Then Carleton's chair scraped, and he stood up and put out his hand. "Dahleen," he said huskily, "I'd give a good deal to be as white a man as you are." Dahleen shook his head. "Anyone would have done it for Coogan," he said. End of chapter 7.